thank you for your flexibility with moving to Facebook. I know it's planned to be on YouTube, but our Zoom connection wasn't working, so we decided this platform would work better, so you can actually hear us. We have a wonderful number of panelists for you to talk about this very important issue, which we'll go around and introduce them all in a bit. In terms of format of this, we will each hear from each of our panelists about their answers to the question, kind of what does the coronavirus mean for capitalism? And then the last half hour or so, we'll be taking some questions from the audience. So if you have some questions, just put them in the live stream beside this chat. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce our first panelist, Robert Colville. Robert Colville is the director of the Center for Policy Studies and editor-in-chief at CapEx. Robert, the floor is yours. I think I'm...
Yeah, thank you. And yes, as director of the Center for Policy Studies, as you can tell by the picture behind me, I am in my offices, and it obviously makes clear where I am on the spectrum in this. So the most obvious thing I'd say is that we are very much still in the here's one I made earlier phase of this crisis. The coronavirus crisis is an economic and public health asteroid. It's an unforeseen event. It's something that is going to take a lot of working out. So I think a lot of people, and I'm sort of happy to put my hand up on this, are effectively defaulting to their previous assumptions. If you already thought that it was a good thing to cut taxes, you're going to say the response to this should be to cut taxes. If you thought that a universal basic income was a good thing, you're probably going to say this makes the case even stronger for a universal basic income. If you wanted to destroy capitalism, you now say, well, of course, this shows why capitalism should be destroyed. So with that said, capitalism is, there are a million different variants of capitalism, a million different definitions of it. Capitalism itself will survive this crisis perfectly well, and will hopefully continue to do the job-creating, prosperity-creating work it's been doing. We've seen today in the UK queues of people waiting to get back into Primark now that they finally can, waiting to get back into John Lewis. All bits of the spectrum. The basic sort of framework of the economy, I think will change less than we think. That said, I think there's a version I hope will happen and a version I fear will happen. I mean, I think even before the crisis, we were sort of in a state where we were slightly taking, in the UK, job creation for granted. The UK is amazing at job creation and has had a really good record in the financial crisis. And we were starting to think more about, well, actually, how good are these jobs? How, we were raising the national living wage. We were convening all sorts of commissions on how to improve the quality of work. That was effectively a luxury we had. Likewise, in terms of business, we'd slightly moved on from thinking about, how do we grow the economy? How do we get more businesses to, should businesses be doing good more? What type of businesses should we have? Should business have other priorities just than making profit? The irony is that all this had been accompanied by a time when growth was pretty stagnant. Growth in the UK has not been, or in the West, has not been in a good place for quite a while, and is going into sort of very bad territory at the moment. And I sort of feel like my answer to what should happen to capitalism as opposed to what will is what should happen is we really need to focus on the fundamentals, and the most fundamental point is growth. And obviously without destroying the environment would be nice. But essentially the thing which, like the mess we're in, the hole we're in at the moment, the thing that solves it is private sector companies creating jobs. It's doing absolutely everything we can to incentivize work. And I think what I worry about is that we will find quite soon, that quite a lot of the things we thought were important political discussions were actually kind of luxuries that we could afford when we didn't have, X million people on the dole queue. So I hope what we need to see is a real focus from policymakers on getting the economy working again. And I think hopefully we'll have the luxury to have the other conversations again once we've been able to dig ourselves out of this hole. Because if we don't, then we're going to be left with higher taxes, higher borrowing, higher spending, and it's not going to look very pretty.
Okay, thank you very much for those sobering remarks. Our next speaker is Kimberly A, who's the Miller and Mintz Professor of Economics at Reed College and the author of Open, The Progressive Case for Free Trade, Immigration, and Global Capital. Kimberly?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's such a privilege to be here with this group of panelists and to talk about these important issues. So as Robert predicted, the coronavirus hasn't really changed my priors regarding the workings of capitalism. As I see it, the economic framework we teach our students in introductory economics is basically correct. Capitalism works in the sense that the private ownership of the means of production is generally the best way to organize things. It's more efficient and sustainable at a large scale than the traditional socialist alternative. But that certainly doesn't mean that there's not a robust role for government. And this crisis has really illustrated how important that robust role is. Well, what does the government do? It corrects externalities, it provides public goods, it redistributes income, it provides a safety net. These roles are really essential in a crisis. So in countries where the government has functioned well, and here you might think of Germany or New Zealand or Korea, the coronavirus crisis has been handled well, without raising doubts about the effectiveness of capitalism as a means of organizing production. In countries where the government has functioned more poorly, and here I think the United States fits the bill, as does Brazil and some others, the coronavirus crisis has been handled less well. And this shines a particularly harsh light on the failings of these countries to ensure that the benefits of capitalism's economic growth really do accrue to all in society. To take the US example, the federal response to the crisis has been really very problematic, causing unnecessary deaths. And we continue to be the only rich country that doesn't ensure that its population has broad access to health insurance. We've also seen that the crisis created disproportionate harm and death among vulnerable populations, including, of course, far higher COVID death rates for Black communities and Hispanic communities. So is that a failure of capitalism? Is it a failure of economics? I think those claims would be too broad, but I do see it as a failure of our politics to ensure that we have well-funded government that can respond effectively to these sorts of challenges and that can translate the public will into action. And that doesn't mean government has been completely useless. There are places where it's been really laudable. If we look at the Federal Reserve, they've done a great job providing liquidity. If we look at the CARES Act in the United States, that was a rare instance of effective bipartisan legislation. But we're going to need more. And regardless, we're beginning from a starting point where American capitalism hasn't generated inclusive growth. So why has that happened? I don't think it's an inherent failing of capitalism. I don't even think it's an inherent failing of market-based thinking. But we do have a failure of our political system to generate the sorts of legal changes that are required to make sure that this vibrant economic growth is inclusive. In the United States, those political failures are partly institutional. For example, we see 2 recent elections where the president wasn't the person who got the most popular votes. So Hillary Clinton got 2% more votes than Donald Trump, but yet Donald Trump is president. Al Gore got more votes than George Bush in 2000. We have a Senate that doesn't provide particularly democratic representation. California has the same population as the 21 smallest states combined, but every state gets 2 senators. We also have a voting system that isn't providing equal access to the ballot box, as we've seen with recent long lines to vote in places like Georgia. So this is a problem that our political system is giving, insufficient weight to the interests of the middle class. And there wasn't, for instance, a groundswell of support for the Republican tax cuts in 2017, but yet those happened anyway. So we could certainly argue that the capitalism creates this political dysfunction due to the influence of lobbyists and the role of money in elections. But I would argue that the first step in countering that isn't to rein in capitalism, but to create a vibrant political movement. And if we're lucky, we're kind of seeing the roots of that movement today in the United States. And that can help with things like voting reform, DC statehood, and other things that could change some of these political institutions. One final point that I'll make in the last minute, I would be remiss if I didn't take this moment to sort of advertise some of the arguments of my recent book, Open. The book argues that, we do have a big problem of income inequality and slow wage growth and generating inclusive growth, but that turning away from the openness in trade and immigration would actually create more problems than it solves. And I think that argument is really illustrated well by the recent crisis, in fact, and the current public health and recession are teaching us that lesson more than ever. You know, it is the case that we might need to restrict people movements during a pandemic, and it is the case that we might need to stockpile medical supplies to make sure we have access to them. But it also shows us that if we respond to this sort of crisis by putting up trade barriers on medical equipment or export restrictions and things like that, we actually can make things worse for the public health of the world. And if we respond as the Trump administration has, by curtailing immigration and discouraging foreign students and discouraging H-1B visas and the like, you know, you're actually going to see a less innovative future economy, less scientific discovery, and slower innovation and growth. So in short, what I take from this crisis is that it requires a robust role for government, but it doesn't require rethinking of the benefits of capitalism, trade, immigration, and things like that.
Great, thank you very much for that, Kimberly. I think we might have a slightly different take from our next panelist, Bhaskar Sunkara, who's the editor of Jacobin magazine and author of the Socialist Manifesto most recently. Bhaskar?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. So what does the pandemic mean for capitalism? You know, it's a broad question and you could take it in many different directions, but since I'm a socialist and also judging from how you introduced me, you know, I'll take it the way the questions like these are often met when asked of Marxists. Is capitalism doomed, or even the neoliberal era of capitalism, is it doomed? My answer, I'm sorry to disappoint, is unfortunately, in my view, no. You know, questions like this are posed to socialists, it seems like every decade or so. I remember picking up a copy of Foreign Policy, or actually Foreign Affairs, and seeing Leo Panitch on the cover talking about the crisis of capitalism about 12 years ago. It seemed like Marxists are in high demand every decade or so. And that's simply because, you know, capitalism is prone to crisis. In my lifetime alone, or roughly the last 30 years, you know, we had economic crisis in Japan, we had Black Monday, savings and loan crisis, we had a crisis in Sweden and other Nordic countries in the early 90s, Russia's difficult transition to capitalism and shock therapy. The decade's end, Argentina was roiling in such economic crisis that a lot of people on the left were pointing to a handful of factory occupations in crisis-prone Argentina in 1999 as somehow you know, carrying the seeds of some sort of alternative political economy within it. And of course, it didn't. And then obviously in the 2000s, we had the Great Recession, the European sovereign debt crisis. Now we have the COVID-induced you know, recession. And again, this is all basically within the last 30 years. So, but instead of just saying that capitalism is prone to crisis, I think we, especially those of us on the left, need to focus not just on the contradictions of capitalism or its tendency towards these crises, but the internal mechanisms of stability that has always allowed the system to bounce back. And I think throughout the history of capitalism, it's these internal mechanisms of stability that has defined the system. And we get into the roots of it, but it's pretty simple. Workers are dependent on having profitable firms in order to survive. You might be a worker and you might want to make $100 an hour, but if your wage demands outstrip the ability of your firm to stay profitable, you might earn $100 an hour for all of 2 weeks before your firm goes under. And the same thing applies for states. It applies for center-left governments, social democratic governments that have taken power. They're dependent on funding social programs from a base of profitable, sustainable capitalist firms. You know, these internal mechanisms has always meant that the labor movement and left parties have always been the regulators of capitalism, because there simply hasn't been an alternative political economy. I am a socialist. I do believe that there's the possibility of us imagining a form of social democracy that goes beyond social democracy into some sort of cooperative-based or market-based socialist system. It's certainly what I aspire to, a world without a private class of capitalists with this preponderance of power in our system. But these are the constraints. So, you know, I think, in other words, that a coronavirus bounce back will happen. It might happen fast or it might be slow. Obviously, a lot depends on the response of states and how coordinated that response is. I think the crisis right now is mostly contingent. It's a sharp downturn due to a pandemic, and it might be exposing a certain structural weaknesses, but in itself, it's not particularly indicative of some sort of imminent downfall of the system. I think on the whole, things will adjust and move on just fine, even though certain sectors will be hit particularly hard. The real question for me is a political question. So even though the system might bounce back and be sustainable at an economic level, I do think it's worth noting that popular expectations are changing about the role of states. We've seen so far how fast governments, supposedly hollowed out in recent decades and unable to act, have in fact reacted when capital is threatened and when livelihoods are threatened. We've seen how much emergency relief, if demanded, can be given to workers, from the furlough scheme in the UK to the extensions of unemployment benefits in the US, from our stimulus checks, which again didn't come nearly fast enough for a lot of working people in the US, but considering the pace of how things normally operate when it comes to the US government, came quite quickly. You're seeing even now a lot of workers in the service sector in the US refusing to come back to work because they're making more money from a $15 unemployment insurance, $50 an hour unemployment insurance, than they were with their kind of their minimum wages, especially for tip workers, which in some cases are under $5 in the US. So there's a political chance that we can manufacture acute political crises in the future out of these slow grinding crises of poverty, joblessness, and neglect. It's also possible that the future will belong to the right of various forms, and that this will only speed things up. It's possible that austerity will come next as governments try to balance budgets, especially in the U.S. with our federal system, which means that a lot of local and state governments are in fact really, really stretched. And obviously the rich are getting richer. People have been citing recently that Jeff Bezos has added something like $40 billion to his net worth. So he's back to, I guess, the 150 billion mark that he hit a couple years ago. And I think we'll see that the profitability will be restored and growth will be restored, in part because the bargaining position of labor will be all the more weak. It's a lot easier to tell your boss to, excuse my language, kind of F off if you're in a condition of 2% unemployment than if you're in a condition of 12, 13% unemployment. This is all very, very intuitive. So I think those of us, there's a lot of little changes to capitalism that's kind of beyond the purview of what I could talk about. People are going to be working from home. The service sector, I'm sure, is going to be hit in a really profound way. But what I want to focus on is just simply, we need to on the left, not just assume that crises will do the work for us. We need to work politically. And in fact, historically, at least from the crisis of the 1970s onward, every single time a crisis is hit, it's actually weakened, not strengthened the left. And the final thing I'll say is that the core of our politics still comes from workplace demands and power at the point of production. The power of working class politics come from the powers the workers have, the power to withhold their labor, the power to strike, and so on. So often when we talk about left-wing politics in this new era, people talk a lot about basic income. They talk a lot about just protests in the streets and political demands. I think it would be a mistake to just say that trade union politics are over, because that's still the key point of leverage and strength. I think people still get a lot from their jobs, just even at a personal level, a moral level. People don't just want an income to survive. They find a sense of purpose and place in the work they do, and also that's where jobs come. That's where working class power comes from. There's a lot I could say in the short term, but I think I'll just end there. Capitalism has been going strong for many centuries, but socialist politics in its modern form in the past 170 years has basically stayed intact despite a tremendous amount of losses, reverses, and quite frankly, crimes committed in the name of socialism. So I think there's a long future for both capitalism and for both its historic nemesis going forward. And what's going to determine things is not just the presence of crises, it's going to be politics.
Great. Thank you very much for those comments, Bhaskar, from a slightly different perspective than the other panelists. Our next speaker is Jason Furman, who's a professor at Harvard and served as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama administration. Jason?
Thanks for organizing this discussion. And I agree with a lot of what I've already heard. I agree with Bhaskar that in conversations, 3 of the most tender plants in the universe are capitalism, globalization, and the internet. Because for each one of those 3, I have been in dozens of discussions for decades about how if you do this, it will end the internet. If you do that, it will end globalization. If you do that, it will end capitalism. And yet all 3 of those seem to be with us. I think all 3 of those are with us for very good reason. That capitalism is a great way to organize the production and distribution of goods and services, that globalization is essential to have competition, innovation, scale, and the like, and that the internet delivers an enormous amount of value. And that's why whatever regulatory tweak, whatever you have, doesn't bring any of those to an end ever. I agree with Robert, and I call it now more than everism, that you look at a crisis and you think whatever you thought before is even more true than it had been before. There's a lot of grist. If you think the government messes things up, boy, has the government had more epic mess ups in the last 6 months than it's ever had before. If you think the government is essential, boy, has the government played a bigger and more important and more critical role than it has ever played before. I think both of those statements are true. The heterogeneity in the response across countries that Kim talked about wasn't particularly correlated with who's more or less capitalist or who's more or less, role of government and the like. It is much more heterogeneous, and a lot of it had to do with competence. Competence across countries. Some of it had to do with different theories. The UK, as had a certain theory early on. That theory was very badly and deadly mistaken, with huge consequences for mortality rates there. Sweden has also had a theory that it has executed on. I think it's the wrong theory. So I think the heterogeneity has been a little bit more about a set of epidemiological beliefs and about the competence of executing on them, as opposed to anything that one could use to determine or understand, a system. China, with a very, was able to suppress the initial information about the virus, but it could only suppress it so long, and the like. A third thing is, I think everyone tends to overstate the degree to which everything will change forever as the result of some event. Look back at what people said in the wake of 9/11 about how, no one would ever get on an airplane again or something like that. Relatively quickly, they've gotten back. We see cruise ship bookings for 2021 quite healthy. You can buy tickets to Broadway shows in the month of September. Whether or not those shows actually go on is a different question. But humans have, they love socializing. They love being with each other. I'm not sure if we've accelerated telework and telelearning, or if we've discredited the entire episode of telework and telelearning by rolling it all out too quickly and in too poor a way, and that if anything, it might slow it. It's a commonplace, and probably a commonplace because it's true, to say that all the things that would have happened anyway might happen a bit sooner and faster because of this. If JCPenney, a department store in the United States, was going to go out of business in 10 years, maybe it'll go out of business sooner, and the like. I'll end by falling into my own now more than everism view. And, I think it's actually sort of makes sense to have that attitude. In some sense, I don't want to change my beliefs and views too much for the post-crisis period. During a crisis, by the way, you don't want to bring your pre-existing ideology. If you thought capital gains tax cuts were a great idea in normal times, that doesn't mean that capital gains tax cuts are a great way to solve an epidemic or the economic crisis associated with it. So you do want to think differently when you're in the midst of a crisis. If you're you hate regulation, now might be the time for some new rules. If you love regulation, now might be the time to relax some of the regulations that are impeding the production of equipment and the like. So during a crisis, you want to be quite different, and you want to be very pragmatic. You don't want to be ideological. But afterwards, I, agree with Bhaskar in the sense that, whatever problems you had before, you probably shouldn't change them, and you should ask how you can use this crisis to advance those ideas. And in terms of what those ideas are, I won't outline them in any detail at all because Kim already did, and I agree with her entire list from beginning to end.
Great. Thank you very much for that as well, Jason. Our final speaker in this round robin is Sam Bowman, who is Director of Competition Policy at the International Center for Law and Economics and was formerly a Senior Fellow at the Adam Smith Institute. Sam?
In this panel, and the kind of overriding theme that we've had so far is that this probably doesn't have the kind of long-term impact that it might feel like it would have. And I think obviously the Spanish flu epidemic is something worth looking at, which obviously killed more people than the First World War, but had much, much less of an impact culturally than the First World War. And in fact, it's kind of shocking, something that killed potentially as many as 100 million people worldwide, that the Spanish flu has had such a small kind of long-term cultural impact. So I want to talk about what I think is a kind of marginal threat to the things that I think are important, and to ultimately what I think underlines kind of global prosperity. And if I have time, I'll talk about a kind of second point that's basically unrelated, but I think is interesting anyway. I think most people agree that there is probably going to be a shift towards additional protectionism, and that just continues the kind of protectionism that we've seen, obviously, with Trump, with Brexit, but also within the EU. It's kind of been less noted that the French and German governments are deeply unhappy with the European Commission's approach to competition policy as with respect to the creation of kind of national champions. And the Franco-German governments wanted to allow Siemens and Alstom to merge to create a kind of giant train manufacturer that could, in their minds at least, compete with Chinese train manufacturers, which the European Commission blocked because their fear was that this would raise the price of train rolling stock for European consumers. And I think that we can see a lot of trends like this going on in lots of countries. Obviously, this is driven by things like fear of China, concerns about the disappearance of manufacturing jobs, anxiety about missing out in the EU, for example, the anxiety about not having the kind of Googles or Amazons of this world. And obviously, post-COVID, the idea that supply chain robustness is something that we need to prepare for, and increased fear of China. And the mechanism that I think that governments are going to use to try to achieve this probably isn't tariffs. And in the UK, at least, everybody's heard the term non-tariff barriers again and again and again. And those can be things like regulation, product standards, but a lesser known type of non-tariff barrier is competition policy, which can and usually is a tool for opening up markets and making markets more competitive. But under certain circumstances can be used to make markets less competitive and to protect domestic competitors from foreign ones, or in this case, foreign takeovers and foreign investment. And what we've seen in the US and across the English-speaking world is an expansion of national security tests in foreign takeovers and foreign investments under the guise of national security, but in fact giving governments a huge ability to intervene and block investments and block takeovers for non-national security reasons. So in the US, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act massively expanded the scope of their national security procedures. Australia has just given itself massive powers to override the independent body that it had that can review foreign takeovers. And in the UK, the Johnson government is now picking up plans put forward by Theresa May to massively expand the national security test in mergers to and potentially to turn it into a national interest test. So what this means is governments across the English-speaking world, and in particular, I think in the UK, are trying to give themselves a new power to intervene in any kind of takeover that they don't like. And if this was solely aimed at national security, that wouldn't be as much of a problem. And obviously, sometimes there are sensitive companies, sensitive pieces of technology, and perhaps you do need government intervention in this. But we can see what happens when governments get too much power to do this, when they are, when we look at the recent history of the UK. So, for example, Melrose's takeover of GKN in 2018. GKN is a defense supplier, among other things. It's not a huge one. It's not a particularly important one. It's not in the top 50 of the MOD's suppliers. And Melrose is a UK private equity company. This didn't involve a foreign business on either side of the transaction. Any impact on national security was limited. But under pressure from unions and from the Daily Mail, so from the left and the right, the government threatened to intervene, to use its national security powers until it extracted all sorts of commitments that have nothing to do with national security. So things like treating suppliers well, maintaining a UK workforce, that GKN would continue to pay tax in the UK. All of these may be valuable things, and they may all be things that we do actually want to be kind of extracted as commitments, but they're not national security. And we can see that governments will misuse powers that they are given under the guise of national security to extract all these other commitments. Now, this proposal would expand the government's powers to allow it to intervene in this way in effectively any merger or takeover, not just ones involving foreign companies, but ones involving domestic UK takeovers of UK companies. And this would be completely separate to the existing independent and largely apolitical structures that we've set up since the early 2000s, which have been quite successful. It would create a pathway for lobbying. So the various different interest groups, whether they're political interest groups or unions or suppliers or whatever it might be, all now can, under these rules, can go to the government rather than the independent decision maker and lobby to have a transaction blocked. It's quite important because foreign takeovers are often unpopular but can be really valuable. For example, when Tata, the Indian company Tata Motors, took over Jaguar, it was incredibly unpopular. They fired a lot of people, they did a lot of restructuring, but they're now credited with having turned around the company and saved 35,000 jobs. And it's possible to imagine an independent, and we have examples of independent review bodies allowing these kinds of unpopular takeovers to take place. But it's much, much harder to imagine governments answerable to the media, answerable to short-termist voter blocs, being as permissive. And I think there's a real danger that the UK in particular completely isolates itself and kind of crushes any hope that startups, for example, have of being bought by foreign companies or being invested in by foreign companies, particularly if the work that they're doing is of interest to companies from, let's say, China, which I think Chinese companies should be able to invest in the UK and should be able to buy UK companies. There isn't very strong evidence that this is needed. There are no examples that the government's given of takeovers or investments that shouldn't have taken place and that they would have blocked on national security grounds had they been able to with these powers. There's no evidence at all provided by the government that it needs these powers for national security reasons. It seems much more likely that this is part of the long ongoing trend towards protectionism. And my fear is that COVID sharpens this danger. There is a lot of anti-China sentiment. It's being fostered by people who I think are have a kind of slightly separate agenda. Maybe their agenda is correct. I don't want to make a judgment about geopolitics here, but the two things don't match up. It's very, very difficult to argue that because the Chinese government mishandled COVID or even was deceptive about COVID, that we need to stop AI companies in Cambridge or in Oxford being bought out by Russian or Chinese or Polish or any other foreign buyers. And even if you think that all of these things sound quite desirable, and even if you think it would be good to have government take a more interventionist role, even if you think these independent decision-making bodies aren't doing a very good job, the incentives right now are completely messed up. The UK government has a really strong incentive to prevent UK companies from being bought by foreign companies because it will make the UK look weak and it will make Brexit look like a failure. The US government has a really strong interest in stoking and fomenting anti-foreigner sentiment and anti-foreign investment sentiment for various political reasons. So even if you think these kinds of things would be good, the way the Western governments and the way English-speaking governments are going about them is incredibly dangerous because they're concealing their motives. They're doing it in the least possibly transparent way by using national security as their pretext for it. And I fear that this will be the kind of marginal change that makes COVID very, very costly to us. It's not going to revolutionize things. It's not going to end capitalism. But at the margin, it could make us a poorer and less innovative economy. And that's the sort of thing that worries me. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Sam, as well. And thank you to all our panelists. Before I go to the questions from the audience, I'd like just to jump in with a few questions from me, if you don't mind. A lot of you brought up, all of you brought up the idea that not much has actually changed or will change because of this, kind of now more than everism. Can any of you guys think of anything that you have changed your mind about, whether in terms of emphasis or kind of policy choices? Is there anything that you think kind of you thought was bad and now you think is good?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I certainly think that the UK's furlough scheme has been vastly superior to the approach it's taken in many other countries. And I think that the kind of traditional centre-right free market approach to recessions, which kind of at best focuses on keeping the macroeconomy going and keeping, for example, nominal GDP stable or aggregate demand stable and letting everything else sort itself out, is clearly extremely deficient in this kind of case. And the response, I think, has shifted me in a direction that is more open to, in times of recession, for example, fiscal policy, more open to the idea that there are extreme emergencies where really kind of big micro is valuable, and the state has a role in big micro. I don't really think of the furlough scheme as being a macro policy, even though it takes place on a macro scale. The objective is kind of lots and lots and lots of micro interventions, and that's I think been a big change in my thinking. I don't think that I kind of had a very strong view that previously would have disagreed with it, but it's not really something I had ever thought about before.
So the obvious, I agree with Sam on the furlough scheme. The obvious other thing I'd flag up is supply chains, and I mean, I think we all had a view that this amazing logistical web that we created, that even if there were shocks and disruptions, you could still get, you did change your sourcing, and it was the most efficient way of getting things, and that model kind of works unless every government in the world and every sort of private actor in the world is trying to buy the same products at the same time. At which point you have, as we saw with some of the reagents for the testing, for example. So I think. I think there's a tension, but I hate the idea of autarky. I hate the idea that we should be producing all of our stuff, in the UK just for security reasons. Because I think that's actually, having diversity of suppliers is often as powerful as a source of resilience in things like food, for example. But I do think everyone is now looking at their supply chains and thinking, what, it's probably quite good to have quite a lot of to have a bit more PPE production in the UK, for example.
Yeah, I'm on the supply chains. I think, broadly speaking, they've actually, for most things, done much better than one would have thought, first of all. But second of all, some of the problems have been purely domestic. Some of the biggest supply chain problems in the United States have been with regard to certain types of meat that were entirely domestic, weren't global supply chains. And you look at World War II, and there was massive destruction of German supply chains, and people who went back and looked at it afterwards didn't discover a whole lot of reduction in German ability to make war material and the like. So I think we can overstate the value of supply chains. I think it's easy to learn from this some smaller lessons, like we should have larger stockpiles of masks and the like. more money spent on surveillance of diseases, more money spent on general vaccines rather than specific. Those are certainly some of the changes one would want to come out of this. I think on the furlough scheme and the like, I think it's a little bit too soon to tell, but I think as you know, there's been a tremendous heterogeneity in the way different countries have responded, especially on the labor market. I am a little bit worried that if you tie somebody too closely to a job, you won't enable the reallocation and flexibility that will be a lot of what's going on, and that the American unemployment insurance system might have some benefits in terms of handling reallocation. But I don't have a strong and doctrinaire view about that and how we handle labor markets in downturns. I think we'll learn a lot from this episode and would reform based on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I'll jump in and just say is I went from being a ardent opponent of the universal basic income to thinking that if implemented in certain ways, it could not necessarily be an alternative to the traditional toolkit of left social democracy, but might actually improve the bargaining position of workers beyond obviously the acute problems that it solved for a lot of people. So people receiving extended unemployment insurance and stimulus checks in the United States, in many cases wanted to go back to work, but were able to renegotiate the terms upon which they returned to work and bargain for better wages and whatnot. And it wasn't necessarily an alternative to that approach. So I've softened somewhat on the basic income.
Yeah, Kimberly, do you want to hop in or?
I agree with a lot of what others have said, including particular Jason on both the supply chain issue and in some of the smaller lessons. I guess the one thing I would point out is this seems like an opportunity for us to learn some of these lessons before we deal with other international crises. So climate change is a really excellent example of something that's going to require international cooperation and collective solutions that we've actually done, at times well on, but at times really, really badly on. And so I think, if we view this as sort of a sped up version of some of the same types of policy dilemmas that we're going to be facing in the future, I'm hopeful that we can learn some of the useful lessons there as well, and not burn, the international bridges between countries that are going to be required to solve those types of international collective action problems. So I think this is a real opportunity to learn some of those lessons.
Well, speaking of climate change, which is a great question for the audience that I was just about to read about climate change. So thank you for bringing that up. Pam Thomason asks, to what extent can the corona crisis be used to bring together capitalist goals of growth, goals that at least at the moment play a more subordinate role than usual, and ideas to counter climate change? So what do other panelists think about the relationship between this crisis and climate change? Jason, you look interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, this is happening rapidly. It's a reminder that other bad things could happen. People will make the analogy between this and climate change. Maybe that argument will persuade people. I think the bigger issue is that in the United States, we're potentially will have at some point a green stimulus as part of a recovery plan. That will have something to speak for it because that will create jobs and that will help climate. But it will only do a tiny fraction of what needs to be done to reduce greenhouse gases. And the bulk of what needs to be done to reduce those emissions will be putting a price on carbon, ideally through a carbon tax that has very little to do with an economic recovery plan. And so when you ask about climate, when we look at whatever green jobs, green energy, clean this, that, or the other stimulus we come up with, the important question isn't going to be, is it good or bad, but does it help build support for the bigger, more important, better thing to come, or does it somehow turn into, one big pork project that discredits, green everything entirely? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's, a really, really important political question to ask about what comes next, at least in the United States, where the idea of green jobs, green infrastructure, Green New Deal has developed so much interest.
I would just add one fiscal consideration here too, because one thing this crisis is doing is generating enormous deficits and debt, and that's completely appropriate for this time. But once the crisis is over, countries are going to be looking for new revenue sources, and the carbon tax that Jason just made a good case for is going to be particularly attractive as a source of revenue, when that time comes, because there's only so much revenue you can raise through some of the traditional tax structures that we have in place, which of course we're gonna have to rethink those too, but this might be the time to finally get a carbon tax done.
I guess that isn't really something that either you or Jason have changed your mind about very much in the last few months.
I thought you had gone on to a different question.
No worries. I did go on a different question. So one, I'm going to rephrase this question from the chat a bit, but one question from Ryan Hutchinson is about the lockdown. So yeah, he is asking about one of the things about this corona crisis compared to other crises is sort of inflicted by the government to some extent, like its lockdowns in some places that have been blamed for costing jobs. Do you think that feature of this, that kind of it seems to come from government rather than kind of crisis in financial markets, do you think that will make kind of the political reaction to this crisis different than prior ones?
Well, so speaking as a free marketeer, obviously the fact that this recession has been inflicted by government sort of frees you of quite a lot of the traditional things about worries. The fact that government is supporting the employment market is completely legitimate because it's government which has, for the best of reasons, basically shut down the market. I mean, there's no moral hazard. Doing this is not going to sort of encourage other pandemics to appear. But I think, I think the problems we've got on the lockdown stuff is actually, if you look at the polling, people are having the opposite reaction to that. Generally speaking, the figures have changed a bit recently, but generally speaking, people are really, really supportive of governments and what they've done to tackle this crisis, and not very supportive of business. Even though, as Jason says, the sort of relocation and reallocation of resources has been the fact that we still have food on the shelves, even though we've all changed our living habits kind of massively, is really impressive. So actually, the figures for should we tax business more to get out of this crisis are really, really high. Especially when you say, again, this is Jason's area. Especially when you say should we just tax big tech businesses more? And again, the people kind of thought that before the crisis, but they seem to be thinking it even more now.
It is worth noting that. Sorry, Bhaskar, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
Just briefly, it's worth noting Sweden, which obviously hasn't had nearly as much of a lockdown as most other developed countries, has had just as big, or appears to be having just as large an economic contraction, or almost as large an economic contraction as comparable countries. The European Commission's GDP forecasts are actually worse for Sweden than they are for Denmark and Norway's internal GDP forecasts. And there's a lot of evidence around kind of consumer spending and investment that suggests that this is probably true as well. Now, that could be because Sweden is a very small and a very open economy, but for whatever reason, it isn't necessarily the case that the counterfactual is business as usual or anything like business as usual. It could just be a lot more people dead, as in Sweden, unfortunately.
Well, I think what's key is that this question remains a technocratical one and doesn't become a part of the culture war. So Trump has done a lot of stupid things during this lockdown. One of the less stupid things he said was a warning to not make the cure worse than the disease. And I think there's a portion of liberals within the United States that are just going to be for the lockdown and are going to defend the terms of the lockdown just because. And you're seeing the shifting of goalposts from flattening the curve to everything should stay locked down until there's no more coronavirus, not taking into account the tremendous psychological toll it's placing on people, the devastation it's making to some of our social and civic bonds, and not taking into account, obviously, the economic impact of the crisis. So I think there could be a well-deserved backlash, not just coming from the extreme right or the Trumpist right in the United States from this lockdown if it's not justified in some terms. I'm not in favor of a immediate reopening or something, but I think there the goalposts have shifted in a lot of this debate, and it's becoming, just like so many other things in the United States, completely polarized along kind of culture war terms, where your average liberal telling you to stay completely locked down, and kind of center-left organizations doing their branded face masks, and people on the right just turning to just an utterly nihilistic call for an immediate reopening. And I think we should be very wary of that development.
I know that we started a bit late, but I think you all have places to go, so I'm not going to let this drag on too long. Is there any other kind of closing comments for any of you guys about what this crisis tells about capitalism, kind of in response to what other people have said? Sam,
really briefly, I think the lesson isn't. I think unfortunately the lesson is going to be we should be more prepared for pandemics. I think the lesson should be that we should be more prepared for tail risks and for very, very unexpected disastrous events. And a really simple way of doing that would be for governments to treat risk the way private businesses treat risk. Now, partly for regulatory reasons, Goldman Sachs treats its risk officers and chief risk officer in the same way that it treats other employees, and with the same status that it gives to investors and so on. And lots of other businesses treat risk as a very, very serious thing that needs independent people, it needs scrutiny, and it needs experimentation to get right. And the UK government certainly doesn't do anything like that. We have something called a National Risk Register, but it's really just a sort of handbook of phone numbers that you should call if there's a forest fire near you. I think that one simple thing that we could do is get really serious about risk, appoint a chief risk officer, and have an independent group of people whose only job is to think about long tail events and how we become more robust to all of them. And on the kind of meta point, how we become better at changing policy rapidly when we need to for things that we couldn't possibly expect. Because who knows, the next great terrible event could be something like a solar storm or a super volcano. We have no idea what it is, and I'm worried that the reaction will be to say, well, we just need to make sure we stockpile masks.
Sounds very wise to me, but probably should be unbiased moderator here. Anyone else?
Well, I think it's a reminder that recessions can be really devastating, and there's lots of poverty in the world. There's a lot of need, an urgent need for development. There's an urgent need for growth. So, in other words, I think we need a far left and a center left, and pushing the idea that we still need growth, we still need development, and obviously the growth needs to be sustainable. But we can't have this emphasis on look how many lives we're saving from decreased air pollution and the like, because we're going to lose many more lives from just the grinding of poverty and the other crimes of underdevelopment. And there's still 3 billion people in the world who are living on less than $2 a day, and that's morally abhorrent. And if we just focus on the developed world, I think it would give fodder to certain varieties of this kind of degrowth ideology that I think will really hurt the cause of those of us who know that we need action on climate change, but want to do this in the framework of continued growth and continued development.
In the midst of a crisis, I think is the wrong time to bring your ideology. It's the time to bring pragmatism and do whatever works. We're still very much in the midst of the crisis. When we come out of it, we need to build something much better. I very much agree with Sam on risks in general, and protecting against tail risks is really important. So if what comes out of this is more preparedness on solar flares, that would be a good thing. Not that the solar flare preparedness got crowded out because all that money went to masks. That would be a bad thing. Beyond the preparedness for risks and tail risks, I think there's building the better society and thinking that that's not going to happen in one law. And so you want to ask what the next law is, but you also want to ask how the next law opens up and changes the possibility for future laws and continuing to make that progress.
Thank you very much for that. Oh, Robert, do you want to hop on?
Yeah, well, I just want to say, I mean, I really didn't expect to be agreeing with Bhaskar so much when we started this call, but yeah, I think it's weird. I mean, quite a lot of what we're seeing now, the lessons of this crisis are in a weird way, they're not about economics so much as they are about almost machinery of government. That's something which has come out tonight. It's, the countries which are good at adjusting to this stuff. I mean, I just want to wave a flag for capitalism slightly, that, like, if this had to happen, this is probably the best time in human history for it to happen. You try and imagine just going through this crisis with a Nokia 6310 rather than your iPhone, without Deliveroo or Ocado or Netflix or Zoom. All of these, capitalism does sort of bring us rather good things, and it is the thing which has lifted billions of people out of poverty, and will hopefully continue to lift billions more. So we really need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Great. I think that's the end of this then. Thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time out of their days to come speak with us. Thank you to all people that watched us. Thanks for following us over from YouTube to Facebook. The video will be uploaded on YouTube. Don't worry if you're watching it there. I guess if you're watching it there, you're already watching me there. To get more content like this, subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. On Wednesday, we have a panel on what this kind of moment will tell us about the future of American democracy with Anthony Scaramucci, Wesley Clark, and others. On Friday, we have something on coronavirus and climate change with a bunch of great people. And wherever you are, stay safe. Thanks for tuning in.